I have some things I'd like to cover this morning. I hope they're interesting, and I'm going to save some time for questions, which are always interesting. Like many speakers, I never quite get the message straight. I think the expectation, which I will do, to talk about Silicon Valley is history and where it came from, why it is the way it is, and then where I think it might be going. But to answer an earlier question that Anna posed herself, can entrepreneurship be taught? Let me jump into that argument a minute also. Having taught a course in that for 12 years at Stanford Business School, I like to believe it can be taught, but it can only be taught to people who have the characteristics that can accept it, and that was a point I think you made. I would disagree with one point though, Anna, and that is that I don't think you have to be born with it. There are things you are born with, no question, but your early childhood, your family life, the way you are valued by your parents or loved by your parents or by people influences the self-confidence, because entrepreneurs, the characteristics were brought out one by one, but pretty much you have to have some brain power. Mostly you have to have some training in technology or in the area in which you want to form a company, although entrepreneurs usually form in groups. So you have to have the skills to pull a group together, lead a group, and help it succeed. You have to have an appetite for risk. You have to be able to face failure if it occurs and carry on with perhaps something else, or just take that blow and go on with your company. But entrepreneurship is not so much an individual effort, although some great individuals and they get lots of publicity. You only have to mention, Steve Jobs, for instance, or Bill Gates and those guys. They are extraordinary people, and as someone pointed out earlier, they've changed the way we live and we work in many ways. So I just wanted to say that entrepreneurship can be taught if you have the characteristics of brains and some training and some ability to understand and listen to other people. You have to live with risk, and you have to be able to sleep at night. I'm not even making a joke. We had someone that started a company that we were involved with, and this particular guy was so concerned and so worried about everything all the time, he really couldn't sleep. I didn't ask his wife about the rest of their life, but that must have been pretty bad as well. But anyway, we had to make a change in that company simply, and this guy recognized that problem himself, and so it's these characteristics of stick-to-itiveness. I see you're translating into Russian. I don't know if you have stick-to-itiveness available. And perspicacity, a lot of other fancy words, but mainly it's desire, commitment, passion, ability to instill that passion in other people, and a knowledge of where you're going to go. One of the great arguments right now is, do you need business plans? And I come solidly down on the belief that you need a business plan, whether it's a formal 29-page one with financials and all that stuff, but you have to have an idea, an idea which you can express. That says, where do I want to go? Where does our group want to go? And what are the markets we want to serve? And those kinds of things have to be expressed. I remember, because I've been to Russia more than 20 times since 1990, I'm like everybody else, I'm not an expert on Russia, I've just been there a lot. But one thing I noticed over the years, I might add, because of the 70 years of communism and socialism, that the idea, and because under the training in the old days under communism was strong in technology, there were many, thousands of trained engineers and scientists and people, and so when people began to start companies, and it's even true now, although it's getting better, in the 90s when I first started going there, some other guys and I started the first private venture capital firm in 1994 or 5. The thing that whenever I would judge a entrepreneurial contest or a business plan contest, it was very difficult to get those young Russian entrepreneurs to talk about marketing and sales. the entire presentation had to do with technology, the clever technology, and sometimes intuitively the markets are there, but very little effort was put into studying markets and talking about marketing. So finally, about the third business plan competition, which I went to, somebody said, I'd like to introduce my team. And he said, this particular guy is going to be the vice president of marketing. I almost leapt out of my chair and hugged him, because I thought, now there's somebody who's seeing one of the most important things to do. What entrepreneurial people do is they serve markets. They serve markets often with technological ideas, but most importantly with products that people want or can be made to want. So I just wanted to jump into that. Can entrepreneurs be made? Because one of the great strengths of Russia, besides a energetic and historically accomplishing people, is the fact that there is strong technological education, which is continuing in Russia. I won't talk much more about Russia because it's a favorite place of mine, but I'm hopeful, and I've heard many times lately people talk about marketing and that you have to determine some markets before you start a company. So I'll leave that part. But so to depart from what my instructions were, Anna, I want to talk a little bit about venture capital. One of the reasons you ask the old guys to get up here is to sort of interpret the past, perhaps, and see what it means about the future. So I won't go way back to when I was a kid within 10 miles of here in the summer picking apricots and prunes, which was the entire product of pretty nearly the entire product of the Santa Clara Valley. And the distance between Palo Alto and Mountain View was great, where we are. Between Mountain View and Sunnyvale was big farms, and as you drive around the area, all there was really what we call prune trees, which are actually a plum tree that's designed to make dried plums, and then apricots. The reason I bring that up is that Silicon Valley is really young. It took a while, and I won't trace the history because you all know it, but after World War II, there were a number of characteristics here that were different. I'm not going to use the word unique because they can exist and they can be made to exist in other parts of the world, but in 1906, by the way, it's just to go back a ways, the first wireless company developed between a Stanford professor and a graduate student was started in Palo Alto using Marconi technology. They built a company that later on became Federal Electric. And so it isn't that it's brand new, but there's a kind of a curve for those of you who like engineering training and stuff. It's a curve with an exponent. I can't tell you the exponent, but it started off with nothing, and over the years, it's grown bigger and bigger and bigger, so Silicon Valley is a major force now. But to leap ahead from 1906, after World War II, when I was old enough to be conscious of what was going on, first of all, before World War II, Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett started Hewlett-Packard. Stanford had a strong engineering department and a very strong leader of it called Frederick Terman, who decided that Stanford University could become a center of young companies. And so they started the Stanford Industrial Park, which many of you are located in, to be ungrammatical. And so the growth of Silicon Valley, having had some fine companies, Varian and others, started in the 30s. After World War II, it kind of took off. And why here? Well, I'll just say my own thoughts about why here, and that is that there was educated people, there was a pioneering tradition in California. At a national level, we had what we used to think of as moderate tax rates. They're getting worse, of course. And we had a lack of bureaucratic hurdles to clear to start a company. It's still pretty easy to start a company in Silicon Valley. You have to get a county license, and you have to get something from the state to certify you're a California corporation. But except for that, maybe a building permit or two, it's really not that hard to start a company in terms of legal requirements. And that's not true in lots of places. But I won't go through this history except to say that Silicon Valley just started to grow because it was, first of all, Stanford tried to have it that way. It had its famous partner in Berkeley of leading technology and science. Then the University of California at San Francisco came along later with really first-rate medical and training. So you had three great research universities, and you have to add Davis, which isn't far away since it's become strong since. You had a desire by the community understood and wanted it. Stanford wanted it to happen. There were people around who began to believe that being an entrepreneur was not, you wanted your mother to say, my son's an entrepreneur, as much as you might want her to say, my son's a doctor. They don't say my son's a lawyer much, but even some people do that. So these conditions, which I won't describe much further, except that I wrote a paper about it called The Entrepreneurial Climate, but there has to be venture capital for most companies. You can't start most companies with a shoestring, on a shoestring, so that the characteristics of venture capital availability, you have to have some borrowing around, like banks who understand the business. You have to have services, lawyers, accountants, and the kinds of people that help you make your company go. They have to understand what you're doing. And it all kind of grows together. It isn't as if you put it all in place and it starts. It has to come over time. And I'm asked endlessly as I visit places, including Skolkovo, I don't ask so much, but I speak anyway, that what conditions, how can we recreate Silicon Valley? And my answer is always, don't. Take your own country, most of you, many of you from Russia and some other countries, and find out the characteristics that will make venture capital available and make entrepreneurs want to form companies. And then beyond that, the winning element, which I believe the guys, especially Mr., I can't remember his name right now, but the man who's been the lead of Skolkovo, is to make sure that the entrepreneurs start the companies they want to start, and that the venture capitalists are free to invest in what they want to invest in, and try to keep the government out of it as much as possible. Now, the reasons governments get involved in it is that, first of all, they make some money available to venture capitalists in many countries so that they have some money to invest, or more than privately is available. And they provide space for, and sometimes subsidies for young companies starting, and they inevitably have to make choices about what young companies to back. But in the end, the biggest success part of Silicon Valley is that it was a place that welcomed entrepreneurs, where entrepreneurs were free to start the companies that they wanted to start, and where the venture capital community, which gradually grew just by an exponent, I've been in it over 50 years, gradually grew from a very few companies and a very few people into what it is today, providing capital to these companies to start. The key to it is the ability of people to do what they want to do with only a little enabling help from the government. I don't want to say the U.S. government didn't help. I just want to say it never interfered in my life within obviously what's legal or illegal, what companies we wanted to start and what companies we wanted to back as a venture capitalist. That's a very key part of it. But with that, let me switch over to a little bit about venture capital and maybe and I've made it dramatically said what it was, is, and will be. So let me just launch into that for a few minutes, and if I can make my little clicker work. That's not the top one. It's the bottom one. So I want to make these points, and because time is limited, I want to leave some time for questions or argument, even better. There's really five areas I'd like to cover most thoroughly. First of all, the most important thing in any entrepreneurial system is the entrepreneurs. Venture capitalists tend to feel important. Venture capitalists tend to be treated like they're important by the people that want them, and venture capital is vital. But without entrepreneurs, you have nothing. So the system of Silicon Valley, and the system for many of you from Russia or wherever you come from, whether some Atlanta or Boston doesn't need this lesson though, is to make an environment where people are welcome to start companies, where it's easy to start companies, and where entrepreneurship is fostered the best it can be without overdoing the help. So entrepreneurs are always vital. And then venture capital began, if I might go back with my gray hair, in the 1962 when I began being in venture capital, the previous 8 years were working in a steel mill, so you can imagine what a change that was. But anyone who grows up in Palo Alto and sees mostly academic people, or nowadays sees mostly entrepreneurs, should go to work in a steel mill. You learn a lot about what it's like to work, what it's like to sweat and on the job. And one thing I learned I didn't know anything about was Slavs, Hungarians, and people from Romania. I worked with a lot of guys from Slavic backgrounds. I won't go through all these countries, but in Palo Alto, I wasn't aware. I was aware of Eastern Europe from geography. I was aware of it from World War II, and of course the brilliance of the Russians as fighting people and resisting the Nazis. But I didn't really know people from those places. So this is just a personal note, but people from Palo Alto should go get a real job somewhere always before you decide that academic life and electronics and data-related stuff is life. The other point I'm going to cover some points on is venture capital has grown from essentially something where you invested your own money or you borrowed money, it got started, or had a little amount of money, to the money management business. It went all the way from people trying to either investing their own money, which a guy named Bill Draper and I did. We borrowed a lot of it. I don't mean it was our own. It was nominally ours, at least, all the way to firms that got some other investors. So over time, venture funds became bigger. They became bigger because one law that made it difficult for pension funds to invest in venture capital was changed, or a ruling was changed. And people began to realize that the rates of return, which it really gets down to, for the risks taken in venture capital could be pretty good. And so as people began to see that investing in venture capital could result in, name a number, 18%, 20% internal rates of return, if you know that term. In other words, what you earn on your money became pretty good. So it attracted a lot of capital in different cycles. And so instead of a few guys scratching around trying to feed the kids and making some investments, which really was going on in the early 60s, it became a business, and I'll leap over many intermediate years and lots of cycles, with billions of dollars under management, with fees for the management getting into the many millions of dollars, and the carry providing huge rewards when big deals are done. We don't have to start naming those since we know them. But anyway, venture capital changed because it succeeded, along with the entrepreneurs, in building some great companies. In the early days, it was Tandem Computers, and in the middle days, Tandem wasn't that early, but there were several deals from the 60s. Boole and Babbage was one. A gentleman here worked there, became very successful. The first company, the first of two companies that sold software. The software business is a known business now, but Boole and Babbage in 1967, when it began, was only one of two companies in the whole country that sold software products. You really leased them, and you could drop them into your computer. You didn't have to write your own program. So going back to that, I won't start naming all those names except to say that as those companies succeeded, and the investors in those companies, some of which were private, made it interesting for other people to come into the venture capital business. So universities with their endowments became interested about 1972, and Kleiner Perkins with a lot of effort, raised a $10 million fund. I can't give you the time, but let me just say 1972 or 3. And of course they, by being successful and by hiring good people, built a great venture fund that's still one of the leaders of our community here, but they manage billions of dollars, and so do lots of other people. So the transition of venture capital from a few people with their own capital or money they could borrow or with a few friends became a very large business, and I call it part of the money management business because people have to make decisions about, that the people who manage money institutionally have to make decisions about where to put their money, and one of the places they can put it is in venture capital. But looking to the future, there'll be fewer venture funds because of the last 3 or 4 years and 10 years before that. The returns have dropped off. Plenty of venture funds did not make money. I hate to say that, but it's quite true. It became difficult to make money, or if people did well, if they got their money back to their investors with small returns. So it became much less attractive, although the big funds did well. And of course, with the birth of and the flowering of social networking deals, and those funds that did get involved in that made huge amounts of money. So the result of that has been the survival of and the prospering of several great big venture funds. A few new ones have come in, found their way, and they're prospering greatly, but there will be, for sure, many fewer venture funds in the next few years than there are now. And I'm going to come back to Silicon Valley and on the fifth point, which I will make in a few minutes, about people trying to create Silicon Valley, which is not possible directly, but create the conditions for Silicon Valley, which is possible. So let me just go into a little detail, and without spending as much time as I'd like to, probably more time than you'd like me to, but that's another matter. So as I pointed out, the entrepreneurial climate is vital, and entrepreneurs, without the one thing that must be nurtured is entrepreneurs. Without them, there's nothing to talk about. I think we did startups only in the early days because there wasn't anything else to do. And so we began to associate venture capital with startups being what we were about. Then, as the need for follow-on financing grew, companies had to turn back to their investors, some of whom didn't have much money. They could go public fairly early to raise money. And so venture fund sizes grew because the companies grew up, the size of startups began greater, and people began pouring money into venture capital, especially in the late 70s and in the 90s, when it became big. Fund sizes were about $10 million if you were lucky in the 60s, and many smaller than that when people did raise money. In the 70s, it was hundreds of millions. In the 80s, it became a few billion dollars, and in the 90s, the sizes got up. I'm not talking about the size of funds. I'm talking about the amount of money raised for venture capital nationally. Got up into the hundreds of billions of dollars, or up toward 100, but it didn't keep going. It dropped off. So the amount of money raised this year for venture capital, let me make a guess, will be about $20 billion, or maybe it's been about, if I got my number right, there's been about 6 or 7 billion raised so far this year. But with the stock market coming stronger, with the things going public, with returns, I will think that people will build some enthusiastic about venture capital. But there is one thing, a new factor that is going to provide at least half of all the venture capital as we look into the future, and that is the existence of what I call industrial venture funds. IBM has a venture fund. Cisco has a venture fund. There's dozens of them. There's an organization based in London that even studies them and puts out information about them and has a conference. So I was surprised to see, after a very awkward and difficult beginning, that corporate venture funds are really an important factor now. And they're about, if I have my numbers right, about 25% of all venture capital investment is from corporate venture funds. But it's growing very, very strongly because they put the capital into it. They find ways of incentivizing good executives to run them. One problem was, how do you pay a man or a woman a comparable or competitive salary when the rest of the people in your company aren't making that kind of money, especially if you have profit sharing with them. But they've solved that now. They've got very good people running the venture funds. As a matter of fact, the woman who's here in Palo Alto runs IBM's venture fund is one of the best venture capitalists in the country. And so I don't know her pay scale, but I'm sure she's not starving. One thing that has happened, partly because of the existence of the rapid growth and big payoffs from social networking deals, of course, primarily Facebook, which has its own set of problems now, but is a fine company. And as a matter of fact, on a personal note, I live on a very normal street in Palo Alto, and Mark Zuckerberg decided that he'd like to have a kind of a normal life, as Steve Jobs did. And he bought a house across the street from us, a very nice house, and the first house in the whole area. It's like any other, well, his is one of the nicer houses, I must say, on our street, but it has guards, it has guys parked quietly in cars in front of it, day and night. So I've never met Mark Zuckerberg yet. If you want to meet Mark Zuckerberg, you have to walk your dog at 7:15. Not only I don't get up, I get up that early, but I don't walk and I don't have a dog. So my chances of meeting Mark Zuckerberg are not good, but many of my friends have met him as he parades his dog and his new spouse around the neighborhood. But the reason I bring this up is that the brilliance of the growth of Facebook, the changing of that concept by an entrepreneurial person and group from a college, keep track of your friends kind of thing, to a major part of most everyone's lives in terms of letting people know what you're doing and so forth. Because of my age, I think more than anything else, I've never signed up for Facebook. Maybe I don't want to run into Mark Zuckerberg, I don't know, but I don't want to tell people that much stuff. But that's not true. Most people like to share, many of you, I don't mean there's anything wrong with it, but they like to know, here's some things I'm doing, here's what I like to do, and you know better than I what Facebook does. It's a great communicating system for companies. And Twitter is another one. I've gotten to know the guy that started that quite well because we're working on a very important service organization for young people in high school in East Palo Alto and other places. But his name is Jack Dorsey. And he, again, he and others, but he started with the idea of making it easy, instead of writing an email to 99 people every day, to have something that automatically sent your information to them if they were to ask about it. Well, you all know Twitter as well. So those two, but the reason I mention them right now is that they have provided they haven't made a big success financially yet, but I'm sure they will. But Facebook, for those investors who got into it early, and even for a few got into it late, has been very successful. We don't have to review their IPO, and Facebook is going to face some terrific challenges from young companies. But what happened was that as the success of Facebook was so rapid, apparently rapid, people got used to making a lot of money in a hurry in terms of investors, and is lowered the patience level of people who invest in venture capital companies. Another factor I wanted to mention briefly is that big funds have a hard time doing small deals. Many of the startups that you people, men and women in this room, have done required $500,000 or $200 or maybe $800 to start with. And it's very hard to go talk to a $2.5 billion venture fund about investing in your deal, even though it's it's going to be very successful. Because one resource that all venture firms have besides money is people. And they need, most of them, and I can get arguments, by the way, from big venture funds who say, well, we do small deals, but whatever, it's become much harder to get small companies financed. So there's a bunch of venture funds like ours has stayed deliberately small. We use almost entirely our own money, and we do startups and young companies, and been pretty tough going the last few years, but now we got 3 companies going public and all that stuff. So once again, my pulse has picked up a little bit. So I'm feeling pretty optimistic about the next few years for the small venture companies and for the big ones. But one thing that emerged, why the word came, whether it was ironic or not, the word angels has come into being. And because one reason the angels came up with was that it wasn't that easy to get a few $100,000 to start a company. There were people who had been successful who were willing to listen to the pitches, if you don't mind the pun, of young companies. And so they would sit down for dinner and at the end of the meal, or at the end of the, someone was talking about eat well earlier. After they ate well, they would decide to back these funds or not without a lot of investigation, a lot of it on impression, and also they didn't get a lot of follow-on in most cases. Now, angels have organized into companies now. I call them run by archangels, probably a wrong word, but anyway, it's a very common way of financing young companies now, but it implies non-professional investors who don't do much follow-on. Small venture companies and big venture companies put a lot of effort into their founding, I should say, into following their companies, helping them. I've even, I used to wear a coat and tie once in a while. In fact, I wore one today thinking that Stan would wear one. He did. But I had to really look through my closet to find one. It's amazingly how little I have, except for funerals and weddings, have a chance to wear a tie. So thank you for this opportunity. So as I mentioned, the business has cooled off the last 7 or 8 years because returns have been so bad. Small and private funds will continue to exist. I want to make that point because that's us. Corporates, I already mentioned that amount. And I do want to predict. Predictions are always hard because they're about the future. But I think the IPO market will hold up. I think the stock market will regain interest in young companies. I hope it doesn't go crazy because whenever it goes crazy, it gets bad. But if there's a time to build up, we can take good companies public, companies that have good sales growth, good earnings growth, and have earned their way and need more capital. Then as that happens, the venture capital business, and I'm predicting that for at least for a while, unless something really tough happens, we will have a strong stock market in the kind of companies that we are all involved in. Another point I would like to make before I run out of time, which is already, is that that things like Facebook are facing endless challenges from clever people. Silicon Valley, as you all know, has sort of moved half to San Francisco. So south of Market Street is a Silicon Valley all of its own. I said it's really the Bay Area we talk about when we say Silicon Valley, but San Francisco has become a very important part of this. But there's so many young companies starting which are challenging Facebook, especially Facebook, with all kinds of ways of communicating, ways of bringing circles of friends together. I'm going to a board meeting this afternoon where I'm going to hear a plot and a scheme from our president about how he's going to do one of these social. It's a games company, but I believe they're going to tell us that they want to launch into this other marketplace. But there's hundreds of people doing this. Facebook will have to face some challenges. It is another thing that's changed. If you ask the old men to speak, they have to talk this way. Right now, entrepreneurship's kind of a thing. You have a conference about entrepreneurship, people come to it. People talk about entrepreneurs as if it's as a phenomenon, which it is. But when in the early 60s, there were entrepreneurs, all right, and there was venture capital. It wasn't like a major public issue. You didn't get a front page article in the paper every day. You could hardly, you couldn't talk about it. And I had a course in entrepreneurship, which actually did attract attention, but I didn't start teaching that course till 1979. But the kids would come home from school and say, "Daddy, what is it you really do?" I mean, my friends' dads are firemen, or they're bankers, or they're lawyers, but what is it you actually do? Do you make anything? So I finally said, well, I make deals, but that's all I could say. But I didn't want to disappoint my kids. But nowadays, if you said I'm a venture capitalist, the other kids in grammar school would know what you're talking about. So it's become a kind of a major issue, and lots of people coming out of college or coming out of business school or even coming out of high school or junior colleges want to become entrepreneurs. So it is no longer an obscure area, and it attracts a lot of interest from students. Another thing, of course, that's happened is the internationalization of venture capital. When we formed the National Venture Capital Association, I can't give you a year, but let me say 1972 or so, we were very unaware of organizations that were venture capital organizations. Later on in the 90s, I spoke 2 or 3 times to the Russian Venture Capital Association. There's a European Venture Capital Association, and we even used to have joint meetings with them to explore. They liked it, I presume, because we could talk about what we were doing, but we were fascinated by the fact that the idea of venture capital was taking hold in Europe. So now venture capital is a worldwide phenomenon. It's very active in China. As I don't have to tell anybody here, venture capital has become quite a strong activity in Russia with the limitations I spoke about earlier. But it's a worldwide phenomenon. Entrepreneurship is understood to be important in virtually every country that there is. So this brings us back to Silicon Valley, but fortunately for the organizers of this meeting, I covered that to start with. So with that, having used up more than my time, I would like to ask if anyone would like to make an argument or ask a question. And so does anyone have the first question?
So we have time for one question.
If no one has the first question, we could go directly to the second question. Well, nobody wants to argue.
Any questions?
Well, I guess I'll hang it up. Thank you.